It's an honour and a delight to be able to talk to Greg O'Brien this morning, who was once described by a colleague at the Wellington City Art Gallery as one of Aotearoa's most distinguished cultural odd job men. Greg likes this description. An odd job man is open to all possibilities. He can go anywhere, and he does. On foot, on a bike, in a car with a friend, on a boat with more friends, although sometimes he returns to anchor in his painting and book-crammed cave in Wellington, where he thinks, paints, writes, and imagines. Greg is the author of more than 25 books on artists including Rolf Hotery, John Drawbridge, Graham Percy, Pat Hanley, Barry Brickell, to name a few, and his most recent great work of art, which has taken him 6 years, I think, to write, is the sumptuous monograph Don Binney Flight Path, which is shortlisted in this year's Booksellers Aotearoa New Zealand Award for Illustrated Nonfiction, which will be announced in Tamaki Makaurau next week. He has also written books introducing New Zealand art to children, and a beautiful, he edited a beautiful book called A Nest of Singing Birds, which is the history of the New Zealand School Journal. He's written about Parihaka and the John Scott Chapel of Futuna in Karori, and there's a little band of Futuna supporters here today to support him. And he's a collaborator with many artists on many projects, the most recent of which is probably the Kermadec expedition, which we'll talk about later. But at the base of all this looking, meeting, swimming, traveling, writing, painting, and pondering is perhaps Greg's deepest love, poetry. He is the author of several collections of his own poetry, as well as collaborations of the poetry of Aotearoa with his wife, Jenny Bornholt. And for years, he read poems to us all on national radio on Saturday mornings, which you might remember. Welcome, dear Greg. In 2017, you received an honorary doctorate for services to literature from Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University. In your address, you wrote, "My sense of the interconnectedness of nigh on everything comes from my mother. From my father, I inherited the great, great virtue of bookishness and an Irishness far too complex and unruly to talk about." Could you read us the poem that you wrote to your mother and perhaps talk about the influences of your parents on your working and thinking life?
Okay, am I switched on? Can you hear me? Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Rena. It's very wonderful to be on the couch here with you. I'm chairing a session with Rena in it later, so I guess she has to behave herself, or otherwise I'll give her the rough treatment later on. I do think, what a beautiful hall to be in, but what a beautifully comfortable couch. I think I've done a few writing festivals. I've never been so comfortable before. I sort of think, it's probably because Rena's here, but I also feel like I'd almost put my feet up on your lap and we could continue from there. But it's a delight to be here, and to be here in the Wairarapa too, which, you know, we're so connected to in all sorts of ways. And so it is indeed a great privilege and an honour. I'd love to read the poem right after a poem for my mother. I guess family relations have always been really important to me, you know, and all the connections between the different art forms, but also between people, be it because of genealogy or because of projects. I've always loved working on projects with people. I sort of feel I have a very large and generous family, of which Rena is a member, whether she wants to be or accepts the role or not. So I do feel very lucky. But yeah, this is a poem I wrote after my mum died in 2018. It's a mihi, so it's a poem of greeting. But again, I sort of thought in terms of mum's leaving, it was her arriving somewhere else, but it was also a sort of thinking back to the way everything in nature is connected, and as well as in human life. So I'll just read it. It's called Mihi. So it's from my book House and Contents, which came out about 2 years ago. Mihi. The birds and animals of our mother's land greet the birds and animals of your land. Her waterways, tributaries, and flooded plains greet yours. Now she is gone. She joins the dead of her tribe in greeting your dead. And her dead birds and animals offer this their heartfelt address to your dead birds, animals. And to the living, her constellations greet your constellations, and if they happen to be the same constellations, they wrap their arms around themselves. Her fruit trees in season greet your fruit trees, their fallen fruit. Our mother's clouds and insects fly to embrace your clouds and insects. Her architecture, roads, bridges, and infrastructure rush to greet yours. Her molecules on their upward trajectory entwine with yours. The colour of her eyes, hair, and skin. Her language with its past participles, figures of speech. The sounds and tremors which are its flesh and its bones. These words go out to greet your words and to greet you, these words which will never leave her.
I mean, so one of the things that you will already determine from that poem is that Greg has a deep sense of the interconnectedness of all things. And he'll read it later from some of his memoir, perhaps, and you can see that as well. So, Greg, tell us about your mother and your father and something about how they have affected your writing life.
Gosh, yeah, I guess, I mean, in lots of ways, I do feel very lucky, you know, in my life. I mean, Mum and Dad, they're both, you know, Irish Catholic, so I guess I got a pretty seriously Irish Catholic upbringing through the Catholic schooling system, you know, which, you know, both harms one and elevates one, you know, at the same time, I'm sure. But you know, Dad was a lawyer, but he came from a family of publicans, they're pretty, you know, working class Irish people. My grandparents, I do remember very well, they died during my childhood, but my grandfather didn't immigrate until he was almost 50 from Ireland. And his voice, I remember, as being totally incomprehensible. He spoke some kind of weird Gaelic, kind of inflected. I think he was speaking in English. So the Irish thing was pretty big, but Dad had lots of books at home. So I guess that's the thing, and a lot of Irish literature. So, I mean, I did fall in love with Flann O'Brien, the you know, wonderfully kind of surrealistically inclined sort of Irish novelist. And I do remember, aged about 10, reading his book, The Poor Mouth, a book he wrote originally in An Béal Bocht, was written in Gaelic and then translated into English. But I had an edition of that, a Picador edition of that book, which was illustrated by Ralph Steadman. And I remember age 10 or 11, I loved that book, you know, and I think that book really tipped me over. You know, that's in terms of anything I did later in life in terms of illustrating books. I loved Ralph Steadman. Probably liked him a bit less when I sort of grew up, but I loved the energy and the line and the, you know, many of you, he illustrated Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas by Hunter S. Thompson. But he did those drawings and the ink's always flying around and the people look larger than life and pretty wonderful illustrator. So that was probably my first illustrated book. Coming out of childhood, when I think in childhood, I was all about the Moomintroll books. There were certain books that happened, but certainly I think in terms of adult reading and what my parents handed me, I think Dad handed me Flann O'Brien, and then also we had all basically the Irish kind of corpus. We had sort of, you know, we had James Joyce, we had Sean O'Casey, we had Samuel Beckett, we had those books at home as a kind of given. But also Dad did introduce me to, you know, across the Irish Sea, Dylan Thomas. You know, we had the collected poems of Dylan Thomas and various books about Dylan Thomas. So probably my idea of a poet, you know, for better or worse, was sort of informed by kind of early exposure to Dylan Thomas and listening to it. We had a record of him reading Under Milkwood. And, you know, so that was a big thing. So that was, I suppose, literature was coming from Dad, but I think something that was very important that came from Mum. Mum was from Taranaki. She was from Opunaki. So she was very much a woman of a girl growing up of the provinces. And I think from her I got a great sort of, I suppose, a kind of inheritance of that landscape.
Well, perhaps you might like to read your little poem about coming from Taranaki in memory of Stephen Hickey.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Because that's a short one, but it does kind of encapsulate coming from Taranaki. I've got it here if you can.
Actually, I've got it. I think have you?
Yeah, just
Okay, here we go.
down the bottom. It's in two columns.
Yeah, so I mean, most of my childhood memories are of Taranaki. I mean, I was brought up in Auckland, but I think in some ways, where you go to school can be quite a nondescript sort of experience. I went to Sacred Heart College in Glen Innes as a secondary school. I went to a convent school in Meadowbank. But actually, when we went down to Taranaki during the school holidays, because Mum took us down there for all the school holidays, sometimes for long weekends. So really, my childhood memories, Mount Taranaki sort of towers over them. It's sort of I have a really strong sense of that as a kind of a tūranga waiwai. I mean, I was born in Matamata, so I was born in the Waikato, but that sort of doesn't really figure. I mean, Taranaki was really an important place for me, and remains so. So I wrote it on the premature death of a cousin of mine, Stephen, Taranaki. I have no breath but yours, nor as many words, the orchard a tumble of fruit, the mountain again in its lather of cloud, surf cast or reeled in the sun in a whitebait net, or waylaid mid-afternoon between everybody's and the enterprise, and the mountain always on your shoulder, a Torana gone around the clock, near new moon on its bonnet, long line and lure, beach break and unquilted mountain, wayward one.
Thank you, Greg.
I think the thing with my mum, I mean, she, a Pākehā family, but they were incredibly sort of interwoven really with a big whānau, the Tito whānau. They lived at Tinamu on the northern end of Opanaki. And I do think probably I've had a strong interest in my life in the Maori side of things because of my mother, who was, basically she was brought up by the Tito family. So she was sort of whangaed out into a cultural situation, which I think affected her quite deeply. She always sort of identified to some degree as Maori. And when I came years later to do the the Parihaka exhibition at the City Gallery, the Parihaka people just completely welcomed me on the back of the connection with the Tito family. So I was sort of very made at home there. Interestingly, when you go back to my mum's history, I'll just tell you a very quick story about her grandfather, Cockatoo Hickey, who was a famous fist fighter and a ruffian, an Irishman, serious Irishman on the coast in Taranaki. But at the end of one various wave of land wars, and this would have been in the, I probably can't quite give you a date, maybe in the 1880s, but basically there was a big fort at Opanaki, a big redoubt. So basically it was where the English constabulary and the army basically based. There was the big Maori population at Parihaka, and the land at Tinamu between these two places was a no man's land, and no one wanted to put anything to farm it or anything because basically it was seen as the demilitarized zone like in Korea. And so anyway, my grandfather, JC Cockatoo Hickey, because he had a Maori wife at one point in time, he said, if I'll take the land. So they actually gave him the Tinamu allotment because it was seen as being a very troublesome, and you're going to end up with no end of trouble if you take on this land. So he took it on. Again, I think this is in the 1880s. It was probably after the Parihaka invasion. And of course, he never had any trouble ever because he was on both sides of the fence. He knew both peoples, and so the family still have the farm to today. And no one's ever really grumbled about it. And there would always be Maori people on the land visiting Urupa. There were things to this day that still go on. So it was quite a nice thing. So I felt like this was through no doing of my own. I didn't hear it. A kind of conversation between Maori and Pākehā, which was slightly, I think, probably kind of slightly enriched and opened up by my mother's connection through the Tito family, and she was the godmother of various Tito children, and it was something when we had the Parihaka exhibition at the City Gallery in 2000, which I curated and co-wrote a book on. I took my mum down from Auckland to the exhibition, and she could go through all the old photos of the kuia from the 1930s and name them, in the old photos and things like that. She sort of had some kind of real knowledge. So in that score, I sort of feel like, in some ways walking into something like Parihaka is very problematic, but weirdly, I felt quite
peaceful about it.
Yeah,
actually.
and same I think with Fortuna Chapel, John Scott, with the bicultural narrative that's part of that place. I sort of feel it's my own story. It's actually all of our story. I'm not trying to be kind of feel special about this, but it is.
One of the things he said in this address at Victoria was that he sort of felt very connected to the letter P in the alphabet because his his friends and his ancestors were all policemen or pugilists or other difficult things that start with P, and he ended up being a painter, he thought, and a poet. He wanted to do both, and then fortunately he actually married another woman who was also a poet. So the P, and he's got a son now who's a pianist. So P is a very important word in the O'Brien, letter in the O'Brien family.
Can I read out the little poem about that?
Sure.
Just to reinforce exactly what you've said, but I think it's quite a nice thing for me to, and I'm sort of claiming all sorts of allegiances here. I'm claiming I'm a Taranaki man, I'm an Auckland man, I'm a Roman Catholic Irishman, but this was the thing I did. Actually, I went to County Cork, I got invited to the Cork Literary Festival. This was about in 2012, and so I went over there, and so genetically that's where I'm from, and of course, during a poetry reading at an event like this, someone got up and said, my name's Kaylin and I'm your second cousin, and all this sort of thing. And, and various people would look at my face and say, they wouldn't just say because my family were from Cork, you haven't got I've got a North Cork head. It's actually, they could tell me the suburb the shape of my face came from, So there was this kind of thing of being owned by Cork, but of course, I could never feel I loved being there, but I did not feel at home. I felt a lot more at home on the marae at Parihaka, on the Paipai. That's, if I'm then being honest there, it's, I'm an Irish citizen, I'm as Irish as as the old Blarney Stone kind of thing. But in so genetically, but actually, here we are. And these are my books, and they've got a lot to do with Aotearoa, New Zealand. But anyway, this was just the beginning, the first bracket of a poem that I wrote when I was in Cork. Really, it was just my bit of self-analysis. It's my ancestry DNA poem to myself, a genealogy. We are injured. We hurt easily. Our genes decided that for us. As my mother decided early on, I would have an occupation beginning with the letter P. Coming as I was, as we all were, from a line of policemen, publicans, and pig farmers. 3 Ps loudly stated, unlike those 3 adjacent Ps found lately on a musical score, pianissimo. Hence, but less than intentionally, I became a poet, a slight variation upon the typewriter keys. My genes, a further variation, played and occasionally listened to, like the violinist on St. Patrick's Bridge, adjusting the angle of her instrument so it doesn't fill with rain.
Oh, thank you, Greg.
So,
That's lovely.
So St. Patrick, thank you. St. Patrick's Bridge is a bridge in Cork.
And starts with P's, same with a P.
There's a lot of P's in there.
That leads me on very well to my next question, because after Greg went to university, he decided that, yes, he did want to be a painter, but he recognised that he wouldn't probably be able to earn a living being a painter. So he thought he'd, what did you say, play with both ends or something like that? Play around with both ends. Perhaps be a poet, you thought. So which wasn't probably assured of a very high income either, but never mind. You said you were fortunate to be born at a time after the war where you were able to be a friend, but get to know, and in some cases become friends with a group of painters and poets who are very important to you. Could you talk about who they might be and how they've affected your craft in both writing and perhaps painting?
Yeah, I guess I think probably the art that I was looking at when I was growing up. I mean, Dad had a Wollaston, watercolor on the living room wall at home, an original one, and we had some prints, but we also had a Francis Hodgkins painting. Back in the days when they weren't particularly sought after, actually, it was kind of. But so we did have art around. For me, I guess I just sort of think for some reason I fixed on the art that really moved me seemed to be the kind of art like that of Don Binney that was like a pioneering modernism that was, I never really loved the old colonial art, but I think I kind of got interested in the art really that was from Wollaston and McCann onwards, and most of the artists in fact were born between the two Second World Wars. That was the art that I sort of grew to love. And then I guess in my life as a writer and a curator, I sort of somehow found myself walking into the lives of these people. The first one was Ralph Haltery, and I did Out the Black Window in 1996. So he was born in, I think, 1931. John Drawbridge, born the year before that, the printmaker from Wellington. I sort of felt like I led a sort of a charmed life because I actually met these people and worked with them, and I started curating exhibitions as well. So that was, I guess, the next thing that came on board in terms of I wrote poetry. I ended up writing about art. The first non-fiction book I wrote was called Moments of Invention, which was a book of kind of interview-based profiles of New Zealand writers. And I suppose I was 25 when I did that, but it gave me a ticket to ride. I went around the country and I interviewed Kerry Hume at Okarito. I hung out in Dundas Street, Dunedin with Hone Tufare. I met up with Janet Frame in Auckland a number of times. And these are all people that, in a way, became part of my life too, because they're people I saw, through the years, and some of whom I became quite close to. I was taught by Carl Stead at Auckland University, so he jumped into that book and he was on board already, really. But I sort of feel like I had a great privilege of being able to, in a way, and a lot of these people were my creative models, for the kind of poetry or the kind of art that I wanted to do, and I was able to actually explore them and know them and write about them, and I suppose that's the nature of my charmed existence.
Yeah, because you said in that book, it's called Moments of Invention, and he basically got in a car with Robert Cross.
The photography,
and just went everywhere. But Greg, I'm just explaining for you in case. You said, you imagined the book being bookended by Margaret Mahy and Janet Frame. Do you remember saying that?
Yeah, I did say that. I remember. I mean, because they're my godmothers. Yeah, that's what they are. I mean, Margaret, I loved them. They were amazing people.
Our New Zealand imagination or something
They
like
are,
that.
yeah, because to me they were, I suppose in a way, if, some kinds of New Zealand writing, I guess, as it evolved, was very much about the kind of realism or whatever. Some of the models, I guess, that we looked at school, Man Alone, Mulligan and stuff like that. I mean, terrific books, I'm not being critical. But actually, to me, I remember when I started reading Margaret Mahy, which wasn't during childhood particularly. I think I've definitely started discovering her in my late teens, and also Janet Frame. To me, they were radical. They were really high-flying spirits. They were people and they created worlds. They worked language. They were almost like in that Irish tradition, I think. The James Joycean kind of tradition. They played with language, serious play. Serious, dark. Existential play, but they were people that actually creatively just threw themselves into the whole thing. And so I did think of those two as being kind of possibly, as my role models for writers, really.
Well, that's lovely that you say that, because the other thing that we talked about was poetry and painting. And Out the Black Window is your book on Hotary, which is a book of how Hotary has worked with poets all the time. Can you say something about that and the French tradition that you felt that?
Oh yeah, well I suppose I've always loved image making. I've always been drawn to art that sort of, in a way that how would you say it? Sort of, it's kind of, I've always been drawn to the poetic in all the arts. I love kind of the paintings of Pat Hanley, the paintings that bring things together that are unexpected. They're not trying to depict a room full of people. They're trying to depict the energy that might flow between people in a given space, and nature, all this bringing together different things. So, I mean, Ralph, whose work I really came to understand through a friendship with Bill Manhire, who was also in my book Moments of Invention back in the 1980s, that was. So to me, Ralph was the great sort of embodiment, really, of this, probably the two sides of my brain, if you like. There's the brain that writes words, and then the side that is all about colour and form and mass and the concerns of painting. And so again, that was an education, though. It's not like I had these ideas figured out and then I went and looked at these people. I found with all these projects, some of which are arranged along the front of the stage here, it's just such a learning thing. And so with Ralph, obviously Ralph took me more into the Maori world, but also he was a great lover of the French tradition of the artist book and the relationship between poetry and visual images. And he loved the books of Paul Éluard and Picasso and Matisse and Aragon. And there's a whole lot of a great tradition in France of painting and poetry being very, very intimate bedfellows, if you like, being very close to each other. And in France, it seems to me that's a more evident thing. In the English tradition, probably poetry drifts off towards being close to novels or a kind of idea of literature and a book culture. But actually in France, poetry is something that seems to have a very, kind of close relationship to the visual arts. So, so this is just part of, I guess, the kind of things that I'm learning, Rena, as I've been going along. And, and then about 12 years ago, I got involved with the Fortuna Trust you mentioned before. And so with Nick Bevan, who's sitting here in the front row, hey, Nick, we edited a book on John Scott's, modernist building in Wellington, Fortuna. And again, to me, that's me learning. I don't come into the room as someone that knows about architecture. I love being on the Fortuna Trust because I'm the most ignorant person in the room. It's great to be the most ignorant person in the room because then everything's coming to you and you're receiving it because you don't have all your preconceptions and you're not laden down with information. And I do think when I met all those writers back in the 1980s, the thing that was so wonderful because basically, I could go and, sit at their feet and just sort of listen. Witty, Hamira, Patricia Grace, Ian Weddy, Alan Curnow, Loris Edmond, a lot of them. And it was, so I think I started off, when I left school, I was a journalist. That's something I have in common with my wife, Jenny Bornholt, who I've also learned a lot from, needless to say. But learning just really in a way to be attentive. And we still do T-line shorthand, still make notes. And, and I think journalism was an interesting kind of little opening of a door, not to become a journalist in any kind of ongoing way, but just to be attentive and to ask questions, kind of questioning thing.
Yeah, you might I hope you're beginning to understand that, Greg is a great connector. And so he wrote the book about Fortuna, and one of his most recent collaborations was with, Robert Oliver and his vials, and what's the word? Taungapora musician, and this amazing concert at Fortuna where the vials came together, and Robert Oliver, who is a descendant of Atkinson, who was at Parihaka, made his music as a kind of expiation for what his ancestors might have been responsible for. And Greg read out throughout all of this, and he's also Barry Brickell's brother-in-law. So everyone so
Robert Oliver
is. So everyone in the room seemed to be connected. So Greg read some of Barry Brickell's rather extraordinary writing and talked about Driving Creek. The vials played, and so did the musician, the Taungapora musician. And Robert Oliver said that the vials and the Māori instruments were the sort of were linked because the viols were the forgotten people of the orchestra because had a quiet sound and the cellos had got bigger and brighter. And we were only now realizing just how valuable Māori instruments were. So everything was connected, and Greg was the great sort of impresario linking it all together.
Don't think so.
It was quite a marvellous experience
Yeah.
to be at that concert. There's a little book down there which...
Actually, there is a film about the concert, which is in the Dock Edge Film Festival, which the program of that was released about a day ago. So it's actually going to be showing probably around the country.
Really worth, if you can see it, really.
So it's an interesting, but it's, yeah, again, what we're talking about here, it's totally on this theme, of connectednesses across cultures and links between people, but also between different art forms. I mean, the thing that I found very interesting in the time I spent with Robert Oliver, who I've known for years. I mean, he did the music at Jen's and my wedding, 30 years ago, next week, in fact, our 30th anniversary. Robert did the music for our wedding, so we had Monteverdi and some Handel, beautiful music. So music's always been part of it, but I do think that thing with viols, it's about vibration too. I do think poetry and those things, it's about, the sounds, the kind of the pulse, the living thing, but also a kind of tremor. And I do think that that's what I feel in language, and also I do what I experience in front of, the paintings of, of Don Binney, of Ralph Haltery, of, Rosalie Gascoigne from Australia, a sense of just a kind of sense of, things are alive, things move,
Yeah.
Hey, just think, Rena, can we backtrack? Because I'd like to say something about a Binney painting. Just to jump back, just because actually this is what I was going to say, but actually I think I jumped away from it. But in terms of the influence of my parents and the paintings in our house, it's got a, hang on. It's just here coming up. There we go. Okay, no. When I was a child, when I was 8, my parents they gave me a mounted Don Binney print of this painting, Pipi Whararoa Mating. It's the one on the right there, and it hung on my bed from the age of 8 until I was 18. I remember originally I thought it was the original painting because it was sort of like a poster, but it was mounted on hardboard and had like a string behind it and hung on a hook, But that was hanging above my bed, and when I think back, and I know when I started doing work on Don Binney, I went back to my childhood memories of my bedroom and thinking, well, what was it about that painting? It's a painting about nature, but it's also about colour and it's abstract too. It's kind of got energy. It's got, I'm mentioning a vibration or a quiver. It has a real pulse, undulation that goes through the landform as well as through the birds themselves. So to me, I kind of wondered if this painting was like a key pretty much to just about my entire life. I do remember as a teenager when I realised I didn't even knew the name of the painting. It was the first Binney ever bought for a public collection. It was bought for the Auckland Art Gallery in 1964, and they are the ones that made the reproduction of it, hence the painting arriving on my bedroom wall. But yeah, when I was a teenager, or almost a teenager, I remember finding out the title of the picture was Pipi Whararoa Mating, and I'm being kind of horrified. It was a bird sex painting above my bed, and because it never really occurred to me, and I felt terribly sort of being a prudish young Catholic boy, having taken all that on board, I sort of couldn't really cope with it. But then I sort of thought, well, in hindsight, I think something of the spirit of that painting did actually kind of get down off the wall and get in me. You have something above your bed, be it a crucifix or a Jimi Hendrix poster or a Don Binney painting. It's sort of one identifies with it, and even more so, actually, I sort of thought when I was doing the Binney book, actually, in a way, what my life had been about was actually not so much Binney coming down off the wall and inhabiting me, but I'd actually gone up the wall and I was now living inside Pipi Whararoa Mating, In my life, the background, the stylised landscape in the background is Te Henga near Auckland, a place we go every year, so I felt like I've almost geographically inhabited that painting, but also in terms of what it is, it's an interesting proposition. It's a painting it's of nature, but it's not naturalistic. It's about a different kind of energy and different form. It's about modernism. It's got the 20th century blazing in it, as well as it's got sort of ornithological kind of content. And to me, sort of a painting like that, I sort of feel like that probably was something. And that was my parent. My parents, gave it to me. Might have been for my 9th birthday. It was probably the part of my 9th birthday present I was least interested in at the time. But it got up there, so I don't know. people with grandchildren or children, yes, I think, furnish your children's rooms with interesting work that will affect them, change their lives later on.
Well, this would be a good moment for us to talk about the Binney book.
Yeah, sure.
Because this is a beautiful book, and what he's written about Binney, I think, tells you so much about the paintings. Perhaps you'd like to read the beginning, of his being a little boy by himself, to give us a bit of background about Binney.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting when you write a book like this, in a way you do sort of weigh up your own life. I mean, I'm not really a biographer, although this book is quite close to a biography of Binney, although I stay close to the paintings, but I do talk about, his life, because to me, actually, his personality and his story is when you actually start, when you know it, actually the paintings are totally infused. They are autobiographical paintings, even the Pepe Whararoa mating at Te Hinga. It's all connected with stuff that was going on with him. So I did write the book, and it's been interesting because I've had a lot of letters about the book, but I remember, Dick Frizzell wrote to me in a very nice letter, but he said he loved reading. He thought it was like reading a novel. He thought it was quite a ripping yarn. I thought, yes, not that many art monographs, because it is a bit of a job of a book to handle, because it weighs 3 kgs. So it costs about $150 to post a copy to England. If you want to buy one and post it to a friend in England, don't do it. Just don't do it. It's not worth it. Yeah, I mean, Binney, I didn't know Binney. I met Binney a couple of times. He was someone I always felt quite different from. I mean, I think he was very, I mean, he taught at Elam. I know and I interviewed a lot of people, people like Liz Thompson and Carl Morn, people I know very well, artists who were taught by him. He seemed to be a slightly different species to me, so I probably related to Binney less than I'd related to someone like, say, Pat Hanley or Ralph Houtery. There was a big Catholic connection with Ralph, and this one about France and French Catholicism and all this other sort of stuff. But so Binney I always found quite different. He was a high Anglican. He went to King's College, In fact, whenever I've done quite a few talks about Binney in the last year, and there's always someone in the audience who went to school at King's with Don Binney. Is there anyone here today? Can you put your hand up? This might be a very rare event where there's actually not someone that went to school with Binney. But anyway, he was an extraordinary character, and I do love those paintings. And as I say, I feel like the paintings are a part of my life. In fact, actually, when we did a talk at the Sargent Gallery in Wanganui just a week ago, and someone in the audience did say they thought that my own painting and my own artwork had obviously been clearly influenced by Binney, and I'd never actually really thought about that. But then I thought, well, yes, these things, but also just flat planes of colour, a sense of design, a sense of balance, yeah. It's funny, I mean, you just keep learning stuff all the time, and I've learned a lot about Binney since I finished the book too. In fact, actually at that same thing, and I did in Nelson. Someone put their hand up and said, a woman at the back of the room said, when I had questions about Don Binney at the end of the session, she put her hand up and said, "I almost slept with Don Binney." Anyway, it's kind of, I like the almost in that. Anyway, I'll just have a quick, hang on, just give me a minute. So I start off with his childhood again. I mean, Rena, you're talking about, in a way, I do think it goes back to childhood. I do think, and that's the thing, that's almost the thesis of the Binney book, is that actually he was an only child in a very fraught domestic environment. Birds were a way of escaping. He became an ornithologist so he could go away on the weekends and get away from his family. He was hugely formed by his childhood and by his parents. And my story is a totally different one to Binney's, but yes, I think we are. And yeah, I think probably just about everyone I've ever written about, Ralph Houtery, really strongly shaped, Janet Frame, obviously, by just the sort of the things that are presented to one and that one sort of internalizes as a child. But anyway, I'll read the first couple of paragraphs just of talking about, it's called the beginning introductions, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Bird Watcher. Birds were flapping and diving deep inside Don Binney's conscious and subconscious mind for some years before he struck out as a teenage schoolboy across the Manukau mudflats with his ornithologist tutor from King's College, R.B. Simpson. The Manukau Harbour story, often told by the artist, presented something of an originating myth, accentuated for effect. He even went so far as to claim that he was an ornithologist first, a painter second. Like much that Binney said, this pronouncement should be taken with a grain of salt. Numerous exercise books survive from early childhood, all crammed with flying and striding storks, ostriches, kiwi, and weka. These suggest that birds were an entrenched part of his imaginative life from infancy. Strictly speaking, Don Binney was a painter of birds before he became an ornithologist. The young Binney was manifestly captivated by the imaginative potential of flight in the human as well as in the avian realm. In a formal photographic portrait from the early 1940s, no doubt commissioned by a doting mother, he holds a model aeroplane, possibly handed to him in the hope of eliciting a smile or to fill the idle minutes while film was changed or lighting adjusted in the photographer's studio. One of Binney's earliest memories was of aeroplanes flying low over the family home in Parnell, Auckland, during the concluding phase of World War II. Quote, "The sky outside was filled with real aircraft, which I was assured were ours." A mixture of wonder and curiosity, augmented by a little anxiety about what passed overhead, would stay with him through life.
Yeah, so interesting. Thank you, Greg.
Oh, thank you.
Because the other thing, Binney didn't paint very many paintings with more than 2 birds in them. They're almost all solitary birds, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. And again, this is my thesis, and I think it's right though. I mean, he is the bird. The lone bird was him, and in life he travelled alone. To the consternation of family members, I'm sure. He did see himself as being quite a lone kind of figure. He was an only child.
And you can see it in his work.
Yeah.
Yes.
But there's a joy in the work too. They're not pieces of introspective self-pity. They're full of him sort of stepping outside himself into a broader realm too at the same time. So I don't want to make them sound like they're self-obsessive pieces of indulgence, because they're not. These paintings, I love these paintings more. I spent 6 years doing this book. It's quite a big book. It's got about 500 pictures in it. I spent a hell of a lot of time. The words took less time than tracking down the paintings. That's just took an incredible amount of time. But I sort of feel that, I've spent this amount of time with this work. I sort of really feel the book's a very strong statement on his behalf. And I think people haven't been looking at him enough. And that's happened to me quite a few times, Rena, in terms of the things I've written books about. I've always felt a bit, not that I wanted to get preachy about it, but I do think when I did the book on Ralph Hawtori, Ralph's work wasn't looked at in the early 90s very much. You could buy Ralph Hawtori's for very cheaply, and then it all changed. Same with John Drawbridge, I think was really underrated because printmaking was seen as being a little bit of a secondary art form, and he did a lot of printmaking. But again, I sort of thought, this is great. We did a big Drawbridge show for the City Gallery. I wrote most of the book. I felt like this was good. Same with the school journal. No one had thought the school journal, no one knew anything about the school journal apart from kind of sentimental memories. And so I went through the school journal file and realised that, people like Don Binney and Ralph Hawtori and John Drawbridge had illustrated it.
As well. He was in there, James K. Baxter.
James K. Baxter, and of course, Margaret Mahy and Janet Frame were strong figures in that history. So I feel like often I have been a little bit of a zealot and kind of gone running and saying, "Wake up, everybody! This has been going on."
You're a torchbearer. That's what you are.
Yeah, well, but in a way that I feel honoured to be so, not in a way that I feel I've got. Yeah.
Well, the birds, Binney's birds, are often flying above the water. Before Greg worked on the Binney book, he was part of the Kermadec project. Now, this is where a group of artists went on ship on the NZ, what's it called?
HMNZS Otago.
Up to the Kermadecs, and that's a whole story that keeps on going. Can you talk about the Kermadec expedition and the beautiful book, Always Song in the Water, which is a meditation on not just the Kermadecs, but our relationship, Aotearoa, to the whole of the Pacific, the importance of water, and the importance of song in the water, what that means.
Yeah.
and who came and what you did.
Yeah, okay. Well, I suppose, but again, that sort of almost goes back to childhood again, Rena, because, you mentioned in my book, Always Song on the Water, it begins with an image of a dinghy on our front lawn. We have a Parker Craft dinghy on our front lawn, which my brother and I bought when we were 11 in Auckland and would use, through our, late childhood and teenage years to row around the harbour. We got a Seagull outboard motor. As someone brought up in Auckland, I was brought up with quite a close proximity to the sea. But then sort of everyone in New Zealand is really, we are an oceanic, we are an island, and it's part of our collective identity. So anyway, I guess the thing that happened was in 2011, I got approached by an oceanic group who wanted to raise awareness of the Kermadec Trench and the Kermadec Ridge and Raoul Island, the northernmost part of New Zealand. Again, people weren't that aware of it at the time. To be honest, I didn't know where the Kermadec Islands were at the time they brought me into this. I knew the name, but I thought, are they near Hawaii or something? But of course, they're 1,000 kilometres north of, of New Zealand, of mainland New Zealand. So anyway, I was given the job, I guess, of kind of putting together a kind of like a Mission Impossible team, with that theme music playing, and the tape self-destructing in the telephone booth. So basically, we put together a group of 9 artists. Originally, it was going to be more than that. So there were more, but it just, at a certain point, I think the Navy or someone said, no, we couldn't take more people than that on the ship. And so it did it wasn't quite as Mission Impossible orchestrated as it sounds. But for that, I did actually, get hold of a number of artists who I had worked with, people that I knew, people like Fiona Hall in Australia. There was Robin White from Masterton, who was quite reluctant to come on board, actually. She was the one person that was quite cagey about it. I remember at the time her saying that she was very concerned with social relations and she wasn't, in her art, and wasn't sure she wanted to throw herself into some idea that was to do more with oceanic conservation and different species and all that. But then after a little bit of cajoling, she kind of threw herself into the whole project, and we're all still doing it now. It's 13 years later. We were hugely affected by it. We went on a ship. This was John Reynolds, John Poulet, Phil Dadson from Scratch, photographers Bruce Foster and Jason O'Hara, Elizabeth Thompson. I think I socially engineered it pretty well because everyone got on fantastically and we've all been bonded like a family since. I have been involved in other projects involving groups of artists which are really, tricky, herding cats and all that. But this was because we had to exist on a naval vessel at sea, for a time, and but it succeeded. And anyway, so about 8 or 9 years later, I finished writing the book called Always Song in the Water, which has quite a large proportion of that book is really looking back on the lessons, I guess it is, isn't it? The lessons of those experiences, of being with those people. And it's got work that was made by them as well as by me. So, so again, that was a big conversation between us, but then between us and the scientists on the boat. Actually, that's another thing, Rena. Talking about, this kind of thing of poets and painters conversing, but also I do think the great thing about the Kermadec project, was that we learned, because we were with a whole lot of people from DOC, we were with people from the Navy, we were with, some oceanographic people, we were with people from different fields, and you find their commonalities. That's inspiring.
What do you call the whale specialist? Cetologist. She told you about Song in the Water.
That was the phrase itself, Always Song in the Water, came when her name's jumped out of my head. We had a whale specialist with us who said that the way you judged whether the ocean was healthy or not was that if you put a big, sort of fancy microphone down into it, you'll hear lots of sounds. Everything will be singing. You'll hear the clicking of shrimps. You will hear, the sounds that krill make. You'll hear big whale sounds, booming whale sounds. If there's always song in the water, that means that the species are okay. It means that the ecosystem's working. Mm-hmm. And if the sea is silent, it means, it's been degraded. It's been bottom trawled or polluted or, irradiated or whatever these other beastly things that humans do. So, so always song in the water. I think I'm an optimist. I do think, and I do think my book, the work that we made from that experience was mostly celebratory. The same way I do think Binney's paintings are celebratory. He was very involved in forming sanctuaries, the Aotearoa Little Barrier Island Bird Sanctuary, the Waitakere Range Protection Society. Binney was very political, so he could say, and he was quite angry a lot of the time. He could be a very grumpy man, but actually the paintings that emerged from the studio, to me, are transcendent. They're expressions of beautiful joy, a transcendence, but also of belonging and owning and celebrating this nature that we are a part of.
Yes, and I think that the group of 9 seems to have grown, hasn't it? Because it's become a huge exhibition which has travelled all through the country.
The Comedy Show did. We went overseas, went as far as Chile and the Jabal Centre in New Caledonia, and went to Tonga, Easter Island.
And now, where is it going next?
And now there's almost a new iteration of the show based on Always Song in the Water, which is the carrying on. Again, using more artists to become way part of that ever-expanding whānau. But there was an exhibition, a new edition of the book was published late last year, when the exhibition was on at the Maritime Museum in Auckland. And now it looks like that's going to go to Japan. The Maritime Museum have started quite a significant art collection, so they bought a lot of the work, which is featured in the book that I did, and also there's talk of it going to the Maritime Museum in Sydney. Well, more than talk, there's meetings about this sort of thing. So it's quite nice that things do flow on. But I do feel in my life I've never left anything behind. I'm still on the Fortuna Trust. I'm still dealing with John Scott, bicultural architecture. I'm still learning from that experience, and then the Hotari experience is still going through my life, and it's so what.
Because Greg is the ultimate collaborator. Have an idea, let's do it together.
Well, I did illustrate the book towards Compostela for Rena van Bohemen. So, but we won't talk about that now because that's this afternoon's business. But being a book illustrator was really important for me. And again, I think that was probably almost the first thing I did. Probably as a teenager, I started illustrating, doing drawings inspired by pieces of writing. And I do think, for me, being an illustrator, and I've illustrated books by Bill Manhire, Carl Stead, Marina, various other people, Kate Goldie. I think illustration is interesting because I do think it's a kind of literary criticism. It is a way of understanding a text by going from your own angle and putting images to it. The same way that my way of probably going closer or going further into Don Binney's paintings is by writing about them. By exploring it via words. And I do think, as an illustrator, I love Rena's book. It was through doing the drawings for it that I spent slow kind of working hours. Spent days and days with it. And it. It's nice to be slowed down. And probably every project I've ever done, be it sort of going through New Zealand archives, going through the school journal, wading through this. Miles of, sort of boxes of school journal archives. It is this kind of slowing down. It's not like, doing a search on the internet. My books have never been like that. In fact, it was interesting. There's almost nothing about Binney on the internet. It's picking up a bit now because there have been a lot of paintings at auction. But I remember when I started this book, it was almost like he didn't exist. Because he hadn't been written about very much in recent years. And there was very little, and certainly none of the research material that I got. It was all in cardboard boxes at the Binney in his studio in Parnell.
Well, we've got about 2 minutes left to go. Would you like to read your funny little poem about being a Catholic to end with?
Oh, okay. A funny little poem about being Catholic. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Rena. We didn't quite get on to Catholicism, did we? I mean, we jumped sideways across it.
Perhaps funny is not the right word.
I think, I don't know. I think, just in a nutshell, I do think possibly what I got from Catholicism was a sense that there's mystery is at the heart of everything, and things aren't resolved. Things are always in motion. They're vibrating, they're tremoring, they're changing. We never know everything. We never know enough. Maybe that's why we make art, because we want to sort of move a bit further into that kind of mystery. Maybe embrace the kind of mystery, but not resolve it. You know, what does Don Binney's frigate bird mean? You know, it means all sorts of things. It means different things to all of us. You know, that mystery at the heart of art, to me, is the mystery at the heart of Catholicism, the heart of probably the way I experienced it. But actually, I thought I'd read a poem called The Surfer's Mass, because I thought this probably embodies two things. I mean, one is the surfers, as in, surfboard riders, the connection to the physical world, which has been a big thing for me, and certainly with the Kermadec project, you mentioned being at sea, being in the sea. You know, I've written books about with swimming in them, a lot of immersion in water, a lot of basking in nature, really. I do think I'm someone that really, I love the physicality of the world, but then I also love Robert Oliver's, early music. I love the sound of the tonga poro. I love the way music is of this world, but it's of another world as well. So again, that's another one of the Catholic things. But anyway, this little poem, which I think is quite emblematic of lots of things, it was inspired by when I was a kid, we used to go to the St. Michael's Parish in Remuera in Auckland. And at a certain point, they started having a 5 o'clock mass on Sunday. And the rationale for the 5 o'clock mass in the afternoon rather than the morning was, I think, that basically all the teenage boys that we knew anyway would go out to Piha and surf all day, and so they weren't going to be at mass in the morning. And also, I think all the high-maintenance Barradine girls never got out of bed on Sunday morning, so they invented this thing called the 5 o'clock evening mass, which was always full of all the kind of like as I recall, these very beautiful young women, and then these duty guys who turn up in their Volkswagens with their surfboards on the roof, and so anyway, so this is the poem, which I think lays out my life and my sensibility. The Surfer's Mass. One believes in the other, the awakening body, the soul's repose, that you have to stand up so as to fall down. 5 p.m. at St. Michael's, a trap best laid after a weekend's swell. Saltwater lakes on the pews beneath our board shorts, a trail of sand as far as communion. We were carried in and washed back out. God above all, Fiona's birthmark, Mary Louise's Sunday shoes, and Bernadette come lately from tennis, seen through a veil of incense. Moira of the Roman sandals. It confirmed us in our doubt. Afterwards, the cup of tea in the crypt, then walking home on footpaths that extended beyond description. The wandering mind catapulted out into the early evening, certain that God's love would never give out on us, as brittle and enduring as an afternoon's tennis played with Bernadette or Mary Shanahan until the bitter end.